We have Allison Joe here from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. She's a senior planner and she works on statewide land use planning efforts, including direct support and technical assistance to support local government implementation of sustainable community development and renewable energy policy. So please welcome Allison, please.
I appreciate your sticking it out to the end of the day. This is a really exciting event for me to participate in. I first really want to acknowledge SEEC and their work to help cities and counties reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save energy. The unique collaboration between the Institute for Local Government, the Local Government Commission, ICLEI, and California's 4 investor-owned utilities represents a partnership that is really critical in supporting the work and the policies and really the cultural shift that we are really trying to influence and support and encourage in the governor's office and throughout the state of California. It's kind of a big deal. I don't know if you recognize that. I think a lot of the speakers who have come up here today and throughout the course of the day really do recognize that this partnership is a very unique one. And the tools offered for climate change or climate action planning, venues for peer-to-peer research or peer-to-peer networking and learning, and technical assistance is really represents an evolving field and has lots of lessons to share. And I'm really glad that OPR can be here to be a partner in that effort. So on a personal note, and similar to the conversation that Jean Rodriguez from SoCal Edison had today with Tatiana in the gift shop, I had a conversation with my 89-year-old grandmother. So she asked what I was doing this week. She wanted me to help her out with some things. I said, well, I have to go to this meeting. I told her the topic of today's meeting, and her immediate response was, well, that sounds like a really good idea. Tell them my utility bills are too high. And it's a really much longer conversation, but I'm really working on the next conversation with her, which is about solar retrofitting, making sure that she does maintain a lower bill through more efficient use of her energy systems. The other component that I really do want to talk about, aside from the really unique nonprofit partnerships and the utilities, is really thinking about the people who benefit from the good information and the resources that are out there, which is local government, which are most of you in the audience. What we know, I'm going to try to not use too many acronyms. It's the end of the day. I might abbreviate a couple of things, but I'll try not to. And I'll try to not get too much into the weeds. But we, meaning my colleagues at OPR, the governor's office, know that the local governments that are represented here get it. We know that this is something that you buy into, that your participation and your presence here today, your actions and your role in the Beacon Awards programs, in sharing this information is critical, and it's a sign that you understand the importance. The challenge is sometimes thinking about whether or not the elected officials you work for, sometimes the constituencies you represent, and other stakeholders are also committed to that same long-term effort. And what we want to do is make sure that it's not just about your local community, but it's also about thinking about the regional impact that your efforts have, and also thinking about the neighborhood and household level impacts. Really getting down to who your policies and your programs are affecting. We're also acutely aware that local governments are more resource constrained than ever. The belts can't be tightened anymore. You're actually wearing suspenders on top of that and on life support in some cases. And really the challenge of implementation of any policy and program at the local level can be summarized with the lack of one thing, and that is resources. Today's conversations have highlighted many examples of how those local governments have addressed this issue, and in very creative ways. I'm amazed at the variety and the depth and the creativity. Programs seem to be challenged for legal reasons. There are some communities that are really making a go of it and actually making inroads in trying to have successful financing programs, outreach programs, things like that. But through the development of these unique financing alternatives, developing climate action planning tools, supporting regulatory codes and standards, and other best practices for reducing energy use and greenhouse gases in your community, I've had a really great experience today kind of figuring out at least a little bit of what's out there. OPR, the Office of Planning and Research, does an annual planning of local planning departments. So they track various efforts every year. It's called the annual planning survey. We're not very creative. We track various efforts over time and identify critical needs statewide over a variety of topics, all related to land use planning, all to local planning departments. So we ask those on the ground what's going on. In previous years, survey responses were presented in a document most commonly known as the Book of Lists, because it's a list and it's a book. And basically, we've actually separated in a very unique and creative way, separated the Book of Lists, which is the list of planning directors and their contact information, so there's the list, from the survey results. So there is the directory of city and county planning officials, and there is the annual planning survey results. This year, we actually are very well known for getting excellent response rates from our local planners. We got an 87% response rate this year. Generally a pretty good gauge on what's going on. And we really work to try to refine kind of how we ask these questions, not ask the same questions every year unless we're really trying to track what's going on. We asked a bunch of questions actually this year about climate action plans and kind of what was going on in the communities and climate change efforts at the local level. The question that we asked specifically was, has your jurisdiction adopted or is in the process of drafting policies and/or programs to address climate change and/or to reduce GHG emissions for community and municipal activities? So of the over 500 local governments, we have 451 responses. Approximately 20% of those jurisdictions actually had adopted policies and programs addressing GHG emissions reduction. Another 60% are of those 451 are in the process of adopting such policies and programs. So not a bad number, actually. We also asked in what forms those policies and programs were being implemented. And over 60% of those jurisdictions reported they were being done through climate action plans. So the previous year's annual planning survey asked the same question. At the time, only 56% of the total jurisdictions had adopted or planned to adopt a climate action plan. I'm really sorry, this is numbers focused. It's a little bit of I will go a little bit into the data for a little bit, but I'll come back out of it and go bigger picture at some point. So only 56% of the jurisdictions had adopted or planned to adopt. So in the previous year, only a little more than half. And so in the year prior, or in the subsequent year, there was a 9% increase in jurisdictions that have adopted or will adopt climate action plans. And so the tide is really changing. Actually, it's amazing to see. I'm really struck by the level of effort and the engagement that local communities are starting to get it. They're starting to engage more, and they're trying to realize that there are mechanisms by which we can actually address and start to plan for this kind of larger picture. The tide is changing, but I feel, working for Governor Brown, that there's a couple of things that seem maybe recycled. So it's not a new concept to Governor Brown in a lot of things that we do around here. In his first administration, and for those who have been around long enough and who may have some of the more senior advisors to the governor, they actually refer to it as the first tour of duty. Governor Brown did adopt the first building efficiency standards and the first appliance efficiency standards in the country. As a result, and I think as Pat mentioned earlier, over the past 30 years, California has consumed the same amount of electricity per capita, while the rest of the country's electricity consumption increased by 50%. In the meantime, our economy has grown to about 80% of that. This again still comes back to the need, though, as we have really implemented and had the Governor Brown had the foresight to kind of think about what the big picture was, the need for resources and investment. To meet the governor's goals for 2015, $60 to $70 billion in investment is required. Although we're supported in these efforts by the utilities, we need to leverage private capital and identify ways to make energy efficiency retrofits and financing easier. There's also a big opportunity in terms of existing buildings. We know this. This is, again, I'm preaching to the choir. I hate kind of rattling off some of these statistics because this is kind of the core group of supporters in some ways. But really, existing buildings, the 20 to 25% reductions in energy of 2/3 of our housing stock is pretty significant, and they will pay for themselves in a shorter amount of time than we can even think about. But before any policies, major policies at the state level could even move through the complicated administrative and legislative process. Looking at the Public Utilities Commission's strategic plan for energy efficiency actually calls for that 20% reduction in energy by 2015 and 40% by 2020. And looking at on top of that, the requirements for commercial buildings and step back. The requirements by 2020 for new homes to be net zero energy and commercial buildings to be by 2020, and the commercial buildings to be net zero by 2030, also significant improvements. So a little more context, a little more background, a little more history in how the governor's energy policy really kind of plays out. There are a couple of excerpts from his energy policy. I have a continuing commitment to specific programs and policies that reduce California's dependence on foreign oil, increase the diversity and resilience of our energy supply, and ease the impact of rising energy prices on Californians. Another point is, I'm just kind of reading bullet points here, making existing buildings more efficient is a large and quickly tapped energy source. Low-cost financing for cost-effective conservation measures should be available to all Californians. Direct production of electricity from solar photovoltaic cells is feasible today and should become cost competitive. Improved public information and outreach will be essential to public understanding and action in response to our energy situation. All of those bullets are actually statements from Governor Brown from 1981. Each of these statements still applies today. I could have, again, this is part of I appreciate the ability to recycle some of his talking points. But this is really not news to the governor, which is something that I find incredibly, I'm impressed that he's that persistent, actually. The challenge is that was 30 years ago, and we don't have another 30 years to complete the governor's vision from 1981. We really do need to think of it in more immediate terms. So I work for the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR. OPR's role is to be the comprehensive state planning agency and think about kind of the impacts not only statewide through the state agencies, but also to local governments. And what we are really focused on more recently, and through our director, Ken Alex, is thinking about the impacts of, say, 50 million people. We're at about 40 million right now. So what's the impact of that additional 10 million to our state, to our infrastructure, to our services, to all the resources that we have and that we're trying to conserve? It's about making the direction of the state and identifying what that direction will be when we hit 50 million. And depending on your demographer, everyone has a pet demographer, I'm sure, and it depends on when we'll actually hit 50 million. But we're looking at a ballpark 2050, possibly a little bit later, depending on your demographer. It's about looking at the direction of the state and about making good decisions that will affect future generations. And that's kind of a no-duh, but it's really interesting in the way that our office has really approached this kind of planning effort. I'll get back to that in a second. What OPR does, we also, as you might know, provide some guidance on some of the tools to support some of the state policies that have come through in the last few years. Really clear examples of that are through general plan guidelines. How do locals really address the 7 mandatory elements in their general plan? What about all those optional elements? How do we then integrate what the administration's policy might be on elements or on topics that don't fit within those mandatory elements? So it's kind of thinking about the bigger picture of it all. We also work on the development of kind of implementation of CEQA documents and technical assistance toward those ends. The one thing that we're really trying to do in the development of all those things is look at how do we provide technical assistance to make sure local governments and other stakeholders have the resources they need to be successful in planning. We're really, this is a great example of that. We're really supportive of the use of SEEC, the tools that SEEC has created, as well as ICLEI. And the partnerships in working with Air Resources Board and ICLEI and others to create and augment these tool sets are really quite tremendous, and we're really excited to be a part of that. So these challenges are great. We have 50 million people on the horizon. We have a number of very high goals that the governor has committed us to, and we're really excited about trying to put those to work and to get those done. There are a few of the ways that we're trying to accomplish and at least address some of these challenges. And we'll go back to demography and the changing demography. We're really aware of the changes that are afoot, whether we like it or not. Population is growing, but at the same time, the population is aging. So thinking about the 50 million people, say it's in 2050, say it's in 2060, but also thinking about that baby boomer generation. Right now we have, a significant number of people who are going to be changing their lifestyles as they age. How does that work? How does that affect this group? How do we think about energy and usage and efficiency in that way? For the bigger picture, we can look at one particular lens. We're identifying some long-term goals through the governor's Environmental Goals and Policy Report. So that acronym is EGPR. I'll use that one. It's statutory required report that's required to be updated by OPR in the governor's office every 4 years. The last time the EGPR was completed and presented to the legislature was during Governor Brown's first term in 1978. OPR is updating. Actually, we're not updating because it's not really an update if it's really, really old like that, right? So we're starting from scratch. On a 2012 EGPR document that provides a framework for the governor's environmental policies, incorporating his already established efforts, things that he's done throughout his career, but throughout his second term, if you will. Already established efforts with quantitative goals, performance measures, and data to support or direct those goals. And the EGPR is tied in the following areas. There's 4 areas. 1, environmental stewardship and sustainability. Makes sense for an EGPR. An environmental goals document would have this. Looking at environmental quality goals, reduction of emissions related to global warming, building climate resilience, consuming resources effectively, conserving and restoring working landscapes, wildlands, and recreation areas. The second part is about economic prosperity, also really critical in an environmental goals report. Thinking about a robust and a clean economy, fueled by a strong education system, healthy population, and based in healthy, sustainable communities. A lot of buzzwords there, but all to the end goal. Third part is community and individual health, looking at safe, healthy communities that are conducive to active transportation, transit use, and recreation, and facilitate access to healthy foods, healthy lifestyles, and healthcare. And finally, the fourth component of this EGPR would be equity and opportunity for all Californians. So providing an opportunity for all Californians to prosper, thrive, and engage in civic activities in the state. So this is something that we're actually working on. Louise Bedsworth in our office is actually working on the draft document now. The bigger challenge, it's in some ways a wish list of what we want our California to be like over the next 4 years, but really a bigger overarching document. The other component of it, which I mentioned, is related to indicators and data and seeing and benchmarking to see how do we get there? What do we need to do to kind of meet those requirements and achieve those goals? And that's something that I think is really interesting, and that's something that this governor's office and this governor is really interested in doing, is tying a lot of what we do to real data, to quantitative measurements, to performance standards. So it's a big picture. We can't think about greenhouse gases and reduction of those in a vacuum. There's a reason why we're reducing these emissions, and it all ties back to the environmental goals and policies that we're driving forward. Sorry, I didn't mean to use the term driving, but we're moving them forward. We want to think about who will be impacted by those decisions and plans made in 2012, and how that will relate to the year 2050. Another effort that we've been working on, a little bit different and not necessarily as talked about in these circles, but still really important, is the role of SB 375. Thinking about regional issues and how working regionally we can actually work with the metropolitan planning organizations, the MPOs, to plan for the impacts of the changing demography through the MPO sustainable community strategies, through regional coordination of infrastructure, and through local implementation of those SCSs. These documents should maybe start thinking about and start coordinating with the locals on how, about energy consumption issues, about infrastructure that are alternative to what's provided in a regional transportation plan from those MPOs. The next steps in SB 375 implementation, once those sustainable community strategies are adopted, is to look at these regional plans in the context of how do the locals implement them. How are they implementable in terms of the local general plans, climate action plans, energy plans, capital improvement plans, right? How do you align those policies at the regional level with what's going on at the local level? This is the on-the-ground stuff, to be technical. It's not an easy feat. There are some things that are starting to come about as these SCSs are being adopted, and there's still some challenges, and I think that's the big question as we move forward. So we have this overarching goals and policy report. We have, you have the local level, you have the local general plans, the climate action plans, everything down on the ground, and there's the middle, and how do those two meet? And that's something that OPR is really working towards. But we're excited about because I think there's a lot of potential there. I mean, I think at both levels there's some really great ideas going through, and I think implementation will be the greatest challenge. Another lens to think about is looking at economic vitality. This is a primary component of the EGPR. But looking at opportunities to work with small businesses to implement and encourage the kind of infrastructure we're all working towards here today. It's really to the locals' economic advantage. Again, I always feel like I'm preaching to the choir when I say these things. It's the locals' economic advantage to really adopt, move forward these innovative technologies and programs, and to recognize the overall cost savings. And that's something that I know that this group kind of works hard to convey and to share. It's also about training a workforce who can create and install, maintain, and adopt these kind of technologies to achieve these goals. And then finally, it's looking at how more closely at how the composition of that 50 million residential base in California will look like, and even changes over the next 20 years. This is back to the baby boomer generation. This is back to the aging population and how that population will be affected by what we do now. It's interesting. My grandmother, I'm essentially a third generation immigrant. My grandmother, the one that lectured me on her energy bills, was born in California, so 1923. But she is far more rooted in kind of the very strong immigrant, like conservation, and grew up in the Depression era. Far more rooted in that than my other grandmother, who emigrated from China in the 50s. And so I think that there's a real opportunity here to learn from that generation. But my 89-year-old grandmother, who is living longer through better chemistry and through a cleaner environment. My mother, who's a baby boomer, recently moved from Sacramento to San Francisco to retire in a more urban, compact, and carless lifestyle, and I think possibly to move a little further away from my grandmother. I have not confirmed it, but I'm kind of suspicious. What I want to do is think about those kind of generational differences, not only from an age perspective, but also from who is really adopting these kind of policies and why. My grandmother does this because this is just what she's always done. She saves the plastic bags, right? She'll reuse them too. She'll reuse them over and over again, wash them out, do the whole thing. It's really intuitive in that generational kind of mentality. I admit I might do that every once in a while. But how can we encourage that kind of behavior, that kind of repetitive behavior, because it's ingrained, because it's the right thing to do, it's wasteful otherwise, and apply that to something like energy efficiency? I mean, this is the on-the-ground, household by household kind of effect of things. My mother does something a little similar, and so trying to think about that generation as well, who are more active, my mom. She has not given into, she gave up her car, she's not interested in a zip car, she walks up and down the hills of San Francisco. But how do you think about, it's great exercise for her, sometimes it's hard to track her down. So how do you think about that changing demographic who want to live in a more urban lifestyle, who you want to encourage to be more energy efficient, to think about our resources, and just on a day-to-day basis? It's really fascinating, and at the state level, we don't think about that as much. I don't know if at the local level you do, but this is kind of the challenge. It's like, let's figure out a way to meet in the middle in that. So coming back to the concept of resources. We recognize that there's a need to balance this resource conservation side with kind of a compact urban or suburban development. There's always that fine balance of things. We look at it in a couple of different ways. One of the things that we're really working towards is looking at infrastructure planning, kind of on a different level, looking at solar permitting. I believe, June, released a solar permitting guidebook for local governments. It's readily available on our website. We're working on an upcoming EV permitting guidebook. Michael McCormick, in his session today, talked a little bit about the adaptation policy guide and the local government's perspective of that. And those three things in particular are things that you don't normally see in a mandated general plan. Totally different. And I think those are things that we really want to think differently about as we move forward. But at the same time, we're looking at our general plan guidelines update. So the general plan guidelines were last updated in 2005. Different administration, different kind of goals and policies. But ultimately, we want to make sure that we incorporate some of the things that this administration is working on, such as EV, solar, other renewables, things like that, within the local government perspective. Another kind of resource that we look at a lot and that we're really thinking about is data. The state technology agency, the California Technology Agency, has been working with OPR and the Strategic Growth Council to basically identify geospatial data at the state level. This has been a big effort. This has been an effort that has been tried many times before. I think coming into a new administration, we basically go, the new staff come in, they're super excited. There's all these things going on, we really want to do this. We're like, how come no one's inventoried geospatial data at the state before? That seems silly. And everyone who is kind of an old timer, who has been around for a while, sits and they actually sit in the meeting. I think they roll their eyes, actually, and they say, really? We've done that before, it didn't work. We are actually pretty close to developing and launching our state geoportal, which is basically an inventoried effort of all the state geospatial data at the state level. We basically, through the state GIO, the Geographic Information Officer, Scott Gregory, have identified the layers of data at basically the headquarters level. So it doesn't include Caltrans districts or water districts, things like that, but at the headquarters level. They reported approximately 3,200 data layers, and realistically that's probably close to 5,000, and saw a lot of overlap in data sets. And so the key is to really think about, okay, we've got all this data, you're reporting this, it's the same data, but you're getting it from different sources. Who's the real owner and the real steward of that data? And so we're starting to work through and kind of go through who stewards that data and who is the authoritative source of that data, making things much more accessible and easier to track. So as local governments, in terms of a local government, that's something that we're really working toward. The geoportal is something that we're actually really excited about. We should be able to get something done by there should be a beta by the end of, by September, actually, beginning of September. Eventually, we would love to work towards identifying the data sets we do need, and that ultimately will result in more effective decision making at all levels of government, and really refining our programs. What I want to do is really convey the excitement and the interest that the governor's office really has in the work that you're doing. This is incredibly critical for us. We are at the state level really restricted and constrained by the ability to go out and talk to people. The opportunities that are shared by this group, by SEEC, and by others are really something that we support. We want to be engaged and participate, and we want to work with you to identify kind of opportunities for not only resources, the resources that we do have some control over, things like data and information, things like getting outreach and the word out and supporting organizations that do that, and ultimately incentivize people to think about things in a different way. This kind of goes back to the governor's, although it seems a very broken record, it's something that we really want to continue to encourage. We want to think about how do we change that conversation in a way that gets our end goals done. And ultimately, we are really interested in supporting planning efforts and your efforts in how it will end up supporting the greater goals of kind of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, creating a better community and a more livable community, and ultimately coming back here in 30 years and having a completely different outlook on how things are going to be. Thank you very much.